Okay. Good, we will go on with our two plenary talks now, and we have first Calev Myers and after him Stefan Griegert. We will not have time for discussion between the talks, but we will have a short discussion after the two talks. And I also will skip long, boring introductions and will just say we are pleased and honored that Calev Myers had here and worked as a chair for the Jurisprudence, and also later Stefan Griegert for the political sciences. So please, Calev, thank you that you are here.
Good morning. I'd like to attempt to do two things today which may be revolutionary in the context of this conference. Number one, I want to bring an encouraging message, which may seem a little bit out of place in a conference which is focused on anti-Semitism. And number two, I want to speak less than the amount of time that was actually allotted to me. And everybody can clap for that. But I'm actually encouraged today because I see these, these logos that are constantly turning on the screen behind me. And I believe that these logos together represent a small percentage of the combined resources, creativity, wisdom, and experience of so many NGOs and so many organizations. And if we can just work together and combine our resources and cooperate in an efficient way, anti-Semitism doesn't have a chance. In 2011, about 2 years after I joined the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and this wasn't mentioned by my friend who introduced me, but I'm here speaking as the Deputy President of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Very long name. I'll refer to that as IAJLJ from now on. So in 2011, 2 years after I joined the organization, Israel's diplomatic community was still reeling from the catastrophe of the Goldstone report, which was actually mentioned by Erwin Kotler a few moments ago. Judge Richard Goldstone, a South African Jewish judge, had been appointed by the UNHCR to lead a commission investigating whether or not Israel committed heinous crimes during its military engagement in Gaza in 2009. His scathing report, which accused the IDF, among others, of intentionally targeting innocent civilians, was used by many anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic groups to bash Israel. In 2011, the UNHCR decided to appoint a follow-up commission led by Judge Mary McGowan Davis to ascertain whether or not the parties to the 2009 conflict properly implemented Judge Goldstone's recommendation. The truth of the matter was that even though Israel had completely withdrawn from Gaza 2 years earlier, the Palestinians were in breach of international law by still firing low-range rockets at the western Negev region. How could this important information reach the Davis Commission? As usual, Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs chose not to cooperate or even acknowledge the committee's existence. We can argue as whether or not this is wise policy, but the fact is that something still needed to be done. And this is exactly where an organization like the IAJLJ is critically important. As an NGO recognized by the UN and the EU, we were able to act as special advisors to the Davis Commission. As a relatively new member of the association, I was asked to personally facilitate the video testimony of Israeli citizens wounded by Qassam rockets fired intentionally by Hamas at our citizen population, and some other ones who lost loved ones because of these attacks. The video conference took place on March 19, 2011, in the office of David Buskila, the mayor of Sderot, who was one of the victims interviewed by the UN Special Commission. In our opening statements before the Davis Committee, we also spoke on behalf of kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, emphasizing the fact that Shalit at that time had been held in illegal captivity for over 1,700 days, while being denied access to family members, government representatives, and even the Red Cross. Several victims, as well as Israeli journalists present at the video conference, expressed skepticism regarding the likely effectiveness and outcome of our initiative. I explained that we can only hope that the voice of the victims will be heard, and our efforts are simply to make that a possibility. Now, the Davis Commission's findings were published and submitted to the UNHCR in a final report in March of 2011. Contrary to the original Goldstone report, which unequivocally accused Israel of war crimes and included little reference to Hamas human rights violations, this commission's findings contain unprecedented statements concerning those violations, and I quote, "The committee remains concerned that no investigations have been carried out into the launching of rocket attacks against Israel. It considers the de facto authorities, Hamas, should make genuine efforts to conduct criminal inquiries and to hold accountable those who have allegedly engaged in serious violations of international humanitarian law by firing those rockets. References were also made regarding the prolonged captivity of Gilad Shalit and other recent attacks against Israeli civilians, including the latest barrage of rocket fire into southern Israel. Moreover, the findings included direct testimonies from Israeli victims of Hamas rocket attacks submitted during our video conference. And I want to quote one of the testimonies of a lady who was seriously injured by Hamas attacks, which she gave before this UN body. This is directly quoting from the report that quotes her. One Israeli victim of rocket attacks expressed her frustration at the lack of justice and said, "I have no court, no one to represent me, no one to sue. Is that real justice?" She also articulated her disappointment with the international community. "I was disappointed by the fact-finding mission," this is talking about Goldstone, "and found myself feeling more humiliated than ever in my life, because it seemed to me that there was no mention of Israeli victims, who, like me, have suffered for more than 8 years from rockets and mortars. It seemed to me that no one wanted to issue a strong condemnation of terror coming from Gaza. Since that time, I have lost faith in international committees, especially the UN, as it seems that no one is asking them if I have the right to life." Several weeks following the Davis Commission's report's publication, Judge Goldstone expressed regret over his original conclusions and made reference to the Commission's latest findings in a column published in the Washington Post on April 1st called "Reconsidering the Goldstone Report on Israel and the War Crimes." He wrote, "If I had known then what I know now, the Goldstone Report would have been a different document." And here I have to agree with Professor Kotler that the correct way to combat these forms of anti-Semitism is not by boycotting these committees. It's engaging and influencing to the greatest extent possible. Furthermore, Judge Goldstone called upon the UNHCR to condemn the continuous terrorist attacks against Israel. I quote his article, "Hundreds more rockets and mortar rounds have been directed at civilian targets in southern Israel," Goldstone wrote. "That comparatively few Israelis have been killed by the unlawful rocket and mortar attacks from Gaza in no way minimizes the criminality. The UN Human Rights Council should condemn these heinous crimes in the strongest terms. So too, the Human Rights Council should condemn the inexcusable and cold-blooded recent slaughter of a young Israeli couple and 3 of their small children in their beds." And he's referring to the Fogel family, for those of you who remember. Although many have concluded that Judge Goldstone's regret over his post-Gaza war findings was too little, too late, I believe that it did have value. I also believe that we can attribute his retraction, at least in part, to the work of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and the video conference we held between the Commission and the Israeli victims of Hamas rocket attacks. As the Jewish state continues to fight a battle of isolation and censure from the international community, the IAJLJ's commitment to advocating on her behalf is more critical than ever. Our organization's Davis Committee initiative proves that with a little creativity and persistence, we can really make a difference. Now, the IAJLJ considered it very important to continue making the voice of Israeli victims heard. So after the 2014 military engagement in Gaza, we got involved again from day one in the follow-up committee, otherwise known as the Shabbos Committee. We invested many hours interviewing victims and social workers, providing the Commission with evidence as well as a variety of professional materials. In January 2015, the IAJLJ sent witnesses and its Chief Executive Officer, Ronit Gidron-Tzemach, to appear before the Commission in Geneva in person to provide evidence. In June of that same year, the president of our association, the former president, Irit Khan, together with Ronit, met at the Human Rights Council with Judge Mary Davis, who had taken over for Judge Shabbos. In addition, the two met with many ambassadors in Geneva, and in the end affected the final resolution of the Council, which was adopted, which was much more balanced than the Goldstone report and more similar to the follow-up Davis report. I tell you this story to illustrate that the efforts of independent NGOs in the battle against anti-Semitism are more important today than ever. Our world is changing. As private sector corporations such as Google, Facebook, and Microsoft have larger cash resources than most sovereign nations, there's no question that we are seeing an unprecedented diminishing of the influence of national governments in the everyday life of individuals. Across the globe, many public services that we would never have imagined could be supplied by the public sector are now being privatized. This includes education, welfare, transportation systems, and even national security. I'm not arguing whether or not this phenomenon is positive or desirable, but it is a fact that we must recognize. As private players become more important, some of them act for good, such as Engineers Without Borders. Some of them act for evil, such as Al-Qaeda and Hamas. It is interesting to note that the attack of a non-state actor at the Twin Towers in 2001 killed more people than the attack of the government of Japan at Pearl Harbor in 1941. As power and influence are moving from governmental to private entities, the type of power that affects our lives is also changing. We used to think of power as primarily military or economic. In other words, the stick or the carrot. But there's a new power emerging, which has been coined by Joseph Nye of Harvard University as soft power. In other words, today, it is not as important whose army wins, but rather whose story wins. In such a world, narrative equals power. This, my friends, is the future frontier of the battle against anti-Semitism. BDS, for instance, is moving from the public sphere to the private sphere, from boycott to divestment. This battle will be determined more by CSR reports presented in boardrooms than by legislative bills presented in parliaments. NGOs like the IAJLJ are extremely important today because of our ability to mobilize lawyers who go into boardrooms as well as courtrooms where our governments cannot go to defend and promote our narrative. Even in countries with strong militarily enforced dictatorial governments, NGOs are critically important, exactly because they are not subject to political pressures. I was privileged to personally submit a lawsuit at the International Criminal Court in The Hague in 2017 against Ismail Haniyeh, the supreme leader of Hamas, for war crimes against Palestinians in Gaza. Palestinians could not submit the lawsuit for fear of arrest and torture. Israel is not going to submit a lawsuit against Hamas at the ICC for fear of justifying the ICC. So who is left to speak for the Palestinians? By the way, the ICC has not determined whether or not to indict Haniyeh yet, and their decision will come down to this. Was the armed conflict in Gaza in 2014 an international armed conflict under the Geneva Conventions or not? In other words, was Hamas acting as a private organization or as a state actor? And this question should make many of us very uncomfortable. If, as the title of this conference suggests, we will eventually put an end to anti-Semitism, this will not be accomplished primarily by the Israeli government or any other state entity. It will be achieved through the hard work and persistence of private organizations, such as those gathered here today, which work independently yet alongside government bodies to drive change. With the time left for this lecture, I just want to give a little more background about who we are at the IAJLJ. The International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists is a network of lawyers around the world that was founded in 1969 by several leading Jewish jurists, including René Casson, who famously co-authored the International Declaration of Human Rights, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, Supreme Court Justice Chaim Cohen, as well as the former Attorney General of Israel, Gideon Hausner, who prosecuted Adolf Eichmann. As a nonprofit organization, the IAJLJ promotes and protects the essential interests of the Jewish people and defends human rights in general. We work to combat racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, bias attacks against Israel, the Jewish state, and violations of international law. We approach specific issues of the Jewish and Israeli agenda from a legal perspective and are dedicated to the precepts of Judaism and to the rule of law. Our statements of principle and publications on our website are intended to set out our legal positions on issues that we believe to be of vital importance. We are a recognized NGO and hold Category 2 status at the ECO-SOC at the UN, as well as the European Parliament. We have representatives in over 20 countries, some of you are here today, and hundreds of members in Europe, North and South America, Australia, and Israel. Time will not allow me to present an exhaustive list of all of our victories since the founding of the organization, but I just want to mention a few highlights before I conclude my remarks. In 2008, we were instrumental in the indictment of several senior government leaders in Argentina after it was exposed that they had collaborated with Hezbollah to facilitate the AMIA bombing attack in Buenos Aires in 1994. In 2009, we flew 20 Jewish legal experts to Spain to meet with judges and prosecutors, and after much work, convinced them not to indict IDF officers for the killing of arch-terrorist Salah Shahada, primarily because a proper investigation had been carried out under the Israeli rule of law. We appear regularly before international human rights bodies fighting anti-Semitism in every form. In 2015, we held a side event at the Human Rights Council in Geneva titled Human Rights and Terror, which dealt mainly with Hamas because the European Court was deciding whether or not to remove its name from the list of terror organizations. The little-known fact, which is important to time and time again bring up before these international bodies, is that the primary abuser of Palestinian human rights is the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And it's important to share this truthful narrative. For several years, we've been challenging the mandate and international monetary support of UNRWA, the UN organization which perpetuates the refugee status of millions of descendants of Arab refugees from 1948, keeping their dream of en masse return alive and actively funding terror. We distributed an opinion paper challenging the fact that the same governments that have recognized Palestine as a state still fund UNRWA's refugee camps within the Palestinian Authority, just for those of you who are trying to understand this. You can be somebody who was born in quote-unquote Palestine, lived your whole life in quote-unquote Palestine, and are still recognized as a refugee from Palestine and supported by states that recognize Palestine as an independent state. If you're confused, that's okay. You should be. Recently, we witnessed a breakthrough on this issue that the US government decided to significantly decrease its support of UNRWA. The IAJLJ has been working hard, holding many events and symposiums around the world over the past 3 years in order to urge European governments to readopt the working definition of anti-Semitism of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the FRA, in order to provide tools to identify certain offenses and categorize them as anti-Semitic acts. This will thereafter lead to regulating those crimes as criminal offenses. This includes work and events we held in Vienna here in 2015, 2016, and 2017 in association with one of the leading law firms here, Lansky and Gansgar. We are thrilled that last year the Austrian government, along with other European governments, readopted the working definition of the FRA. We are currently preparing legal activities in Poland regarding the infamous new law which in effect facilitates Holocaust denial. Should the law pass through the Constitutional Court's review and become binding law, we are prepared to take legal actions at various venues to protect freedom of speech and the academic pursuit of truth. You can learn more about our activities in our journal called Justice, which covers our ongoing activities and legal opinions from leading jurists around the world, including critical current events facing the Jewish community worldwide. Just a few more words about the present and future plans of IAJLJ. We recently had new elections of our board and executive committee, and most of the new members of these bodies are practicing lawyers who are leaders in their field. Meir Linzen, the recently elected president of our organization, who apologizes that he had to send me in his place to speak at this conference, he's a managing partner at Herzog Fuchs Neiman, Israel's largest law firm. Meir is also one of the founders of the IDF International Law Unit. We intend to pursue litigation proceedings worldwide concerning matters that are on the association's agenda and in accordance with our objectives. We intend to continue making use of our status as an NGO at the UN and the European Council to make sure that our voice is heard with regards to anti-Semitic decisions and agendas. We intend to continue with ad hoc matters that affect the Jewish people by submitting position papers, amicus curiae to courts around the world, protesting when necessary, and otherwise impacting public opinion regarding issues of concern, including growing anti-Semitism in Europe, apartheid week on American universities and around the world, and the threat of BDS. If you are a legal professional who is passionate about these issues, now is a very exciting time to join our organization and make your voice heard. You can find a simple registration process on our website. If you know anyone who meets these criteria, please send them our way. Let's work together to challenge every form of anti-Semitism wherever it exists. Thank you very much.